Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 7 of the hearings, including anyone observing in the council chamber. So it's 10 o'clock and the hearing is now open. Can everybody hear me today? Thank you. Okay, so my name's Louise Phillips and I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the Epping Forest District Local Plan. The programme officer is Louise St John Howe, and outside of the hearing sessions, any communication should be with her. Firstly, could anyone with a mobile phone ensure it is switched off or set to silent? And could I ask the council to remind us of the fire procedures?
There's no planned fire drill, so if we hear the fire alarm, we need to exit by the door which you came in and down the stairs and assemble on the green behind. If for any reason that route is blocked, we can go out an alternative route, which is that way and down the stairs and out through the council car park. The toilets are located on the stairwells as you came in on each floor.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of filming, as usual, I just need to remind everybody present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of subsequent repeated viewing with copies being made available upon request. So by being present here today, the recording cameras are likely to capture your image and they will become part of the broadcast. This could infringe your human or data protection rights, and if you have any concerns, then please speak to the webcasting officer. You must also activate your microphone when speaking so that anyone watching can hear you. So if I could just ask the council first and then everybody else to introduce themselves around the table before we turn to the agenda. Thank you.
Madam, good morning. My name is Mark Beard. I'm a barrister. I'm instructed by Epping Forest District Council on behalf of the Local Planning Authority. Today we're assisted by Mr. David Coleman to my right and Mr. Tai Tsui to his right, and to his right again is Ms. Alison Blom-Cooper, who we know.
Good morning, Madam. My name is Mary Dadd. I'm representing Ongar Neighbourhood Plan Community Group, which has been appointed by Ongar Town Council, and as Epping Forest know, and I think you do as well, also representing them today. Thank you.
Good morning, Mike Newton from Boyer Planning, representing Hallam Land Management and CEG.
Roland Bolton of SPRU DLP Planning, representing the Peer Group PLC.
Morning, Sanjeev Shah from landowner of 146 Hainault Road.
Morning, Paul Belton of Carter Jonas, representing Pigeon Investment.
Rachel Lord from Dandara Limited.
Mark Barrett from the HBF.
Paul Burley from Montague Evans, representing Quinn Estates.
And Ruben Taylor, QC, representing Quinn Estates.
Good morning, David Neame from Neame Sutton. I'm here today on behalf of the Housing Forum, which, Madam, if you'll recall, comprises Cirrus Land, CK Properties, Catesby Estates, Waits Developments and Gladman.
Ray Ricks, representing Meridian Hill, who have interest in land at Chickwell.
Jamie Stanley of Carter Jonas on behalf of London Square and Countryside Properties.
Derek Stebbing, Stratton Parker, representing Crowdace and City and Country.
Richard Clues, also Stratton Parker, representing Scott Properties.
Rachel Bryan of Saunders, representing Mr. Martin Eldred.
Thank you. Finally, Nick Island, Iceni Projects for Bullwood Limited.
Does anyone have any questions before we turn to the agenda? Okay, thank you. So we're here today to discuss matter 6, the housing supply, including the sources of supply, the housing trajectory, and the 5-year land supply. So beginning with issue 1, will the plan provide a land supply sufficient to deliver the housing requirement of at least 11,400 dwellings over the plan period? Now, I know we've already had a discussion in previous weeks, obviously, about the requirement itself. We don't want to reopen all of those arguments necessarily today. So first of all, I'm going to ask the council to give us a sort of general introduction concerning the modification proposed to table 2.3 of the plan. So first of all, just ask the council to clarify the sources of supply and the amendments required. And if also you could explain the purpose, perhaps, of the spreadsheets that accompany the housing implementation strategy, just briefly, I think that would be useful. And then we'll go on to discuss the the overall supply. And I think as anyone that was here yesterday, it worked quite well in some cases. So I'll ask for the council to address the questions on my agenda and then take comments around the table. Issue 2 will split up a bit more than that. But so if I could start by just asking the council to clarify the sources of supply and the amendments required to table 2.3 of the plan.
Thank you, Madam. To start with, the local plan submission version was obviously submitted or produced and published a while ago, and things have moved on since then. So since the plan was published, the council has undertaken a further round of monitoring, development monitoring, and we've also adjusted to changes in circumstances as a result of the delay in the adoption of the plan and the growing shortfall in housing over the early years of the plan period has required us to relook at the approach we're taking. So the Council's hearing statement for Matter 6 provides an updated position reflecting what is in the Housing Implementation Strategy update. So just to clarify, the original Housing Implementation Strategy document accompanied the publication and submission plan and reflects the position in the housing trajectory, which is in Appendix 5 of the local plan. The Housing Implementation Strategy update, which is EB 410A and EB 410B, represents that updated position to take into account the latest information. So within the Council's hearing statement, the Council has proposed an amendment to the plan to update Table 2.3, which is on page 29 of the submission plan, and that relates to the sources of housing supply in the plan. So within that updated table, I'll just take you through the different elements briefly. The number of homes to be built remains over the plan period 11,400 as a minimum. The number of homes built has increased from 1,330 in the submission version of the plan up to 1,856, reflecting the latest monitoring data. In terms of the sources of supply, the number of sites with planning permission has reduced because of the delivery over the year or so as the time that's lapsed, down to 1,347. That also reflects a high delivery rate for the previous monitoring year. The windfall allowance has reduced slightly. The windfall is 35 dwellings per year, but only for, or that doesn't apply for the next 5 years to avoid double counting. So the windfall allowance has been reduced from 11 years to 10 years, down to 350 dwellings. The housing supply for, future housing supply for the Garden Town communities has remained the same, 3,900. And the requirement to be met through allocations elsewhere in the district has been increased to 5,651. So taking into account the latest information, the total supply is 13,103 dwellings, and that is 1,703 above the 11,400 requirement, which obviously we've discussed in previous sessions. In terms of the spreadsheets that accompany the latest Housing Implementation Strategy update, there are two separate spreadsheets. Appendix 1, sorry, actually I'll check the number, bear with me. Apologies. So Appendix 5 is a large spreadsheet which provides details of all the outstanding commitments in the district. So sites with planning permission that haven't yet been developed, along with their estimated phasing for delivery. And then Appendix 6 provides estimated delivery and phasing for each of the site allocations in the plan, including including the Garden Town allocations. So together they provide a comprehensive overview of the sources of supply.
As a quick note on that, it would be helpful if it could be produced with the allocation reference numbers rather than the FSR numbers. That would be helpful to me. At least you can leave both on, but...
No, I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Were you going, sorry, were you going to say
just
something
bear with
more?
me 1 second. I just want to clarify one point, and I'll
Okay,
just come back.
that's fine.
It's fine. It's just a discrepancy between what I've got printed out and what's in the actual appendix. I was just clarifying something. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coleman. That's a helpful introduction. The first question on my agenda was just whether further modifications will be required after the 31st of March this year. I was just wondering when the next lot of monitoring data would be available to be reflected.
We don't believe so. The Council considers it's appropriate to use the 17-18 monitoring data as the baseline for the examination of the local plan. We are due to undertake annual monitoring for the 2018-19 year, which will commence after the 31st of March of this year, but it's unlikely that that monitoring data will be available until after the local plan examination.
Thank you. Did anyone have any burning points to raise on that, or shall I ask the council to address the next questions? Okay, well, we'll take some comments on that then. Mr. Neame.
Thank you, Madam. Just specifically on the update to Table 2.3, I'll leave all other points to later in the agenda. I think that this goes to the point about what is the 5-year period that you need to consider at the point the plan is adopted. And it's quite clear that at the point the plan is adopted, if all goes according to plan, we will be in the monitoring year that commences the 1st of April 2019. And so it is that 5-year period that we need to consider, because that will be the analysis that needs to be right for there to be a 5-year supply in place at the point of adoption moving forward. I think, therefore, we really do need to have Table 2.3 updated to reflect the position as at the 1st of April 2019. We have some time to go in terms of reaching that adoption point. We will be well into May, as we all know, in terms of these examination hearing sessions. That there are already a schedule of main modifications underway, so that it seems entirely reasonable that update could be undertaken and inserted into those main modifications. I think otherwise it's going to be quite difficult to reach a complete judgment on the 5-year supply position as it stands at the point of plan adoption.
Mr. Burley.
Thank you. You've just been told that the last monitoring year there was 526 dwellings delivered, and clearly that's going to be material to looking at future delivery prospects. If we look at paragraph 1.121 of the monitoring report, however, the council tells us that that may be due to changes in the way that the council's collected its monitoring data, meaning that some of the homes recorded as built in 2017-18 may have been completed at an earlier date, but were not previously accounted for. If the council knows that's the case, Could we see the actual figure for 2017-18, please?
Thank you. Mr. Bolton, and then I'll ask the council to respond to those points.
Just to agree with the point made by Mr. Neem that we need to have the date from the date of the adoption of the plan.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coleman, could you comment first on the date, or Mr. Tsui? Okay.
Sorry, just to confirm, you'd like me to clarify
Sorry,
on
if
the
you
date?
could-
And
Yeah, Mr. Neem and Mr. Bolton made the point that it seems likely that by the time the plan's adopted, we'll be into the year 2018, 19,
1920.
1920 as the... Sorry, what did you say it was appropriate to start with as the baseline?
17, 18. Which, yes, and that reflects the monitoring data on completions for the monitoring year 2017-18.
I just need to clarify, but I thought my understanding of the 5-year period that that we'll be discussing later on was that it was 18-19 to 22-23. Is that right?
That's correct.
18, okay. And so your view, though, Mr. Neem, is that it should be 19-20.
That's correct.
Right,
I mean, we are less than 2 weeks away from
Okay.
that monitoring point.
Fine. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Why, if you could just clarify why it couldn't be updated so that the 5-year period would be, as Mr. Neem suggests?
Quite simply practical reasons of undertaking the work required and doing it robustly. So we have to undertake site visits across the district, and we also have to balance those with the latest planning applications data. So it's not a simple task. It's not as simple as it sounds,
Yep.
And just simply takes time.
And when is it likely to be completed? Would it be completed in time for the end of year monitoring report?
It's likely it would be ready by the end of the year for the monitoring process, as you suggest. I wouldn't like to say how much earlier than that it may or may not be available. Clearly, at the moment, we haven't even got to the end of the year, so it's not on our priority list at this stage. And clearly, we have many other priorities for the team at this moment in time with the ongoing examination.
Okay. And presumably everyone who's sitting here would agree at the moment that for the purposes of our discussion today, we've got no option other than to consider the period 18-19 to 22-23.
I hope not be a lone voice in disagreeing. I think we need to consider 2019-20 because that is the year within which the plan will be adopted.
Okay.
I am, in making this point, not seeking to be difficult, Madam, in terms of the figures that we will come on to, it actually improves the Council's position. If we stick with the 2018-19 position, the figures are worse. So there is a benefit to the Council in taking that approach.
Right. Okay. If we hold that thought then until we come on to the 5-year supply, you can explain that further. Okay. Thank you. And also then Mr. Burley's point that the completions for the 2017-18 year may not be as they appear.
The Council considers that the monitoring year does represent essentially an anomaly. It's a very high rate compared to previous or recent historic delivery rates. But the reason for this is that there are a number of relatively large sites that have completed in the recent year. So the figure is not anticipated to continue at that level in the immediate years. And as I said, it's considered to represent an anomaly.
Mr. Burley, did you make the point, though, that it was for reasons other than that?
It wasn't. It was really just to see whether it was an anomaly or not.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Okay, well, if we go on now to the questions below on the agenda, if people have any other comments in relation to the various sources of supply, you can make them. Then. If I could just hear from the council in relation to the sort of 4 sub-points on the overall supply, and then, as I say, we'll go around the table. You can answer those questions, and indeed, if there are any other issues relating to the sources of supply that we've just heard about. I think it was Mr. Bolton that raised the points that there could be some double counting of commitments and/or expired permissions in the trajectory. So if we hear from the council on that. And then the justification for the windfall allowance, it would be useful to me if you could just give me a bit more information about how specifically that was determined, and whether there's any evidence of how much development was coming forward on small sites, perhaps of the type that are not allocated in the local plan. And you've clarified already, I think, that no windfall allowance is proposed in the 5-year supply. There was then a question that was raised about the contribution of specialist forms of housing, such as for the elderly, and whether that's been taken into account as part of the supply or whether it would represent an additional source of accommodation. And I've put there LOU R14 because I think the landowner was questioning the deliverability of the type of development proposed. And then a specific question was raised, Ms. Dowd, I expect your comment on that, about densities in Ongar. So if I could just ask the council to comment on all of those points, and then we'll go around the table and the council can come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam. So I'll start with the issue of double counting of commitments or expired permissions. The latest monitoring data that we've just been discussing, 2017-18, has now been used to inform the latest Housing Implementation Strategy update, EB410A. Within that, we have addressed all the double counting and removed any expired permissions. Previous development monitoring was carried out primarily through desktop assessment work. The monitoring for the 17-18 year was based on site visits, which utilised more sophisticated GIS mapping and software, which means that we are confident that any duplicated records have been removed. In terms of the windfall allowance, we do feel that the allowance of 35 homes per year is justified. This is because, looking at recent history, all of the housing allocations in the currently adopted local plan had been realised by 2006. So all new homes completed since that time, since 2006, which averages 242 homes per annum, should be viewed as windfall development. And that's obviously far in excess of the 35 figure. The council doesn't expect the rate of windfall delivery to continue at the historic rate following the adoption of the local plan, because clearly the local plan allocates a large number of small sites across the district and includes allocations for sites of 6 dwellings or above. Council considers that the windfall allowance of 35 new homes per annum, again, just for years 6 to 15 of the plan, is reasonable and realistic, and it represents a conservative estimate, taking into account the amount of housing that has been delivered since 2006. If I move on to...
Just
Sure.
before you move on that,
Yeah.
so is it essentially just it's on the basis of a much higher figure in the past, it's just a reasonable estimate as opposed to being derived from any great technical exercise?
I think the figure was developed in the early stages of the draft local plan being produced. I understand that there is a basis, a calculation for it. I'm not able to confirm that today, but that's certainly something we can look into. But it certainly is a figure that is entirely reasonable and conservative. In terms of the next sub-question, the contribution of specialist forms of housing to the supply, I can confirm that specialist housing, including C2 units for the elderly, do not form part of the housing requirement in the plan, the 11,400. and therefore are not included in the housing supply calculations for the plan. The reason for that dates back to the calculations and the recommendations of the SHMA 2015, which is EB 405, and I can refer you to page 106, paragraph 6.20, which explains that. The specific site referenced, Loughton R14, which is land at Alderton Hill, is subject to an ongoing Section 78 appeal inquiry that has been adjourned and part heard. Council recognises that the proposal under consideration is for C2 use, and therefore, if permitted, that proposal would provide additional specialist housing, but would not contribute towards the overall requirement for C3 housing. In relation to site densities, have they been overestimated? Council considers that site densities in the plan are fully justified. The site densities for individual sites were considered as part of stage 6.3 of the site selection process. As part of the capacity assessment, regard was given to a range of factors, including site constraints and surrounding character. I can refer you to Appendix B1.5.3, which is EB 805J. And the reference I've just given you was for the assessment method. The assessment outcomes are recorded in Appendix B1.6.4, which is EB 805N. Looking at Ongar, as an example, the proposed densities for the Ongar sites are set out in Appendix 6 of the local plan submission version, and they range from between 23 dwellings per hectare to 40 dwellings per hectare. And they are consistent with the indicative density guideline set out under policy SP3 of the plan. Given the current evidence, the Council does not foresee any constraints which would impede the ability of the Ongar sites to achieve their indicative capacity. The density level for the Ongar sites also reflects the settlement status and local circumstances, and will help to achieve the best use of land in a district, as we know, where over 92% of the land area is covered by green belts. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we take points around the table now. Okay, so if we start with Ms. Dadd.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to disagree with some of the statements that David Coleman has said, but I want to start off by saying that we have approached EFDC on several occasions to talk about whether the densities could be changed, and we were told quite categorically that no, they couldn't be, and the only way of doing so would be through you, Madam, with modifications to the local plan. We are very, very concerned about the implications of the densities. Mr. Coleman has quoted individual sites. The one for 23 is a very small site with just a few, quite a lot of constraints, but the overall densities is about 40 per hectare. If you also consider that it is the land in Ongar, which is a rural country town of historic interest, far away to the east of here, so we're only 5% of the population. However, developers and landowners have actually come to us and said that they have been told they've got to have these housing numbers stated as a minimum, and they are concerned that they cannot do justice to a nice development in character for Ongar with those densities. One of them has stated that the only way they can do that is to have the number of 1- and 2-bedroom houses to be over 50%, which of course is different to the existing mix of housing, which is 30% of 1- and 2 bedrooms and 45% of 3 bedrooms. We're not really self-sufficient in Ongar, but we do have a very stable community. People like being in Ongar, and they stay there until they're either so infirm they have their children say, please come and live with us. And we want that to be maintained. We've got a secondary school. We have got it's not an urban area, we have fewer community amenities than some of the urban areas. We haven't got a town park or that sort of thing. And the total areas that the local plan have for allocated sites, net hectares, is 16.78 hectares. But I've counted in the infrastructure delivery programme that over 10 hectares should be allocated for open space, playing pitches, etc., which obviously squeezes the average 40 per hectare much larger. There is another thing that is very important to us, and that is the area is obviously, all of these sites are in Greenbelt, but they're all, bar one of them, have got high sensitivity to aspects of the Greenbelt, the openness of the Greenbelt, and also the protecting the historic settlement. And they, all of them, bar one, has got high sensitivity in the land characteristic during the site selection process. So what we are really concerned about is things like shearing. They are got compatible density to their existing. They've got 23 to 26 per hectare. Roydon's 15 to 23. Stapleford Abbots is 17. And the master plans at North Weald are 20, Waltham Abbey 24. So why is Ongar not similar? If I could take an example for the West Ongar concept, that has 40 per hectare density, but the adjacent area is only 20. So it's not in character. So we are very, very worried about this. We're very worried that it's going to change the character of Ongar. Ongar has little employment, it's got poor public transport, but it is rural. And densification, we think, actually could have some social implications. So I mean, what happened to the MPPF's thing about the right homes in the right places? And what about localism? I mean, it seems to me that neighbourhood planning has been mostly, until recently anyway, just treated as an irritation. It's very disappointing also that Epping Forest have decided not to apply for high street funding to regenerate Chipping Ongar town centre, which is badly needed. But the implications for asking for a lower density, we appreciate that the strategic spatial arrangement is for Ongar to have another 590, and that is fine, but we want people to be able to do things and communicate and be a cohesive community. And we think it'd be much better to have the more sites, which we also consider could be delivered just as quickly, rather than this densification, which will ruin the character. Over the last few years, because of the lack of land supply, we have had some appalling decisions on applications where there's been not enough car parking, and everyone in Ongar needs to have a car, mostly to go to work. Some of the approvals have not even been the minimum approved AREBA sizes. And 3-storey on the edge of the settlement with, you know, what happened to the openness of the green belt? I think I've probably covered most things, but you can understand that we're very concerned about not having a voice when we should have.
Thank you. You mentioned just before, I might ask the council to come back on those points specifically before we carry on, because they seem quite specific. Are there particular sites that you're most concerned about? You've mentioned the master plan area. Which is R1? Is it?
It's R1-2, I believe, but yes, we are very concerned about that one, and also R4. If I get my map out, but most of the higher ones on the density aspects, the Greenseed Road site are concerned about whether they can do what they think is appropriate as far as density there.
Which is that one? But I'm not familiar with all of these areas.
R6, is it? Sorry, I'll just find the pages. I didn't repeat what I put in my statement because I know you've read that. Right, Ongar. No, that's not Ongar. Sorry,
After
bear
page
with me.
135.
Pardon?
After page 135.
Thank you very much. It's after Royden, is it? If somebody can give me a page reference, that would help.
Page 135?
I did look at 135 and
Well, after page 135. Are you in the appendix?
Yes, I'm in the appendix.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't in the appendix.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right, it's page 90. We're concerned about R4, edge of settlement, that's 43 density. We also are concerned for Ongar R3 for different reasons. Ongar R5, they've specifically said that they don't know how they're going to get 107 without skewing the mix of housing. And you can see from the map there that a lot of the housing around there has got quite good spaces. Ongar R6 and R7 are not an issue, but they are difficult sites anyway. And the West Ongar concept, which is 234 dwellings in 5.8 acres.
Thank you.
Sorry, hectares.
Okay, we'll ask the council to come back on those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I can confirm, as I set out before, that certainly is part of the work that's been undertaken in the site selection process. We have looked at surrounding character carefully. We've looked at site constraints, and we've also considered infrastructure requirements, and they have been factored into the capacity assessment work. So I gave you the references earlier in terms of the appendices that indicate how that's been done. More generally, in terms of allaying hopefully some of the fears, there are wider policy requirements in the plan that address some of the concerns that have been raised. So specifically, policy SP3 of the plan part 11 of the policy requires that development proposals should maintain and enhance the important features, character and assets of existing settlements. The same policy also does provide a guideline as to appropriate densities for different locations, again respecting the differences in character across the settlements of the district. There are also further ways in which this is considered. So policy DM9 of the plan relates to high quality design, and it requires that all new developments should achieve a high specification of design and contribute to the distinctive character and amenity of the local area. Proposals must be design-led, they must relate positively to their context, make a positive contribution to a place. And then equally within the Appendix 6, I won't go into detail, but Appendix 6 also does have guidelines in terms of, on a site-by-site basis, what needs to be considered. So I think it's fair to say the Council has considered this in great detail, acknowledging that clearly a planning application stage will go to a greater level of detail, but we think we've gone far and probably above what a local plan would do in terms of providing guidance for context and making sure the appropriate densities are there. I've heard Ms Dad mentioned about concerns about delivery of the sites at the numbers allocated in the plan. I have to say I'm not aware of particular issues on particular sites. Not to say there aren't any, but I'm not aware of any. And clearly, through the planning application or through the concept framework process, there's an opportunity to make sure that densities are appropriate and that character is not adversely affected. So the numbers in the plan are minimum numbers, but that doesn't mean to say that if circumstances change or if, as more detail comes forward, that a lower number wouldn't be required if that was shown to be the case. But there's no reason to suspect that will happen, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you. We're going to move on now. So Mr. Bolton. Thank you, Ms. Dabb.
Thank you. Just to comment on Windfall, we agree with the Council that this shouldn't form part of the 5-year land supply, but I think the words you were looking for in the rest of the conversation you were having with the Council was the words compelling evidence as required under the 2012 framework. There isn't, or there doesn't seem to be, compelling evidence. I appreciate that it's a much lower figure than what's happened in the past. However, what's happened in the past has happened without effectively without any local plan allocations, and one is led to believe that the Council have done a thorough research of all potential urban sites, including functioning car parks and open space, in order to identify all potential if you like, larger scale or large scale developments as defined, and therefore really you do need compelling evidence that there is further sources to come from this to come from this resource. It doesn't mean that there won't be some windfall, but if there's not compelling evidence, then you can't take it into account when looking at the local plan, which is my point.
Thank you. Mr. Shah.
Thank you. My main points are in my statements and submissions, but I will note that Mr. Coleman noted that the capacity assessment for housing density. My view is that housing capacity has been reverse engineered through the application of the SSM to produce predetermined outcomes. So if you look to my site, the immediate neighbour received an uplift to capacity based on a positive impact on the surrounding character. My site, right next door, received a reduction to capacity that was based on a negative impact on surrounding character. But then just recently in July, the Planning Inspectorate actually concluded that my site does support development well in excess of the provision within the local plan, with no detrimental impact on the character. So I'd simply request that the local plan at least reflects the capacity already supported by the Planning Inspectorate. Thanks.
So your site now has planning permission?
My site now has planning permission.
What is the reference for your site, Mr. Shah?
The planning appeal reference is...
No, sorry, is it in the plan? Are you talking about a site in the plan?
Sorry, it's, I think, CHIG R11 or it's SR 1010.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shah. Mr. Belton.
Just very briefly, I was just going to echo the comments of Mr. Bolton. I'd agree that there isn't compelling evidence that 350 dwellings are likely to come forward through the plan period. We heard yesterday that the council have made a concerted effort to identify those available sites within the settlements to avoid greenbelt releases. If that's the case, then indeed, if for the last sort of 13 years developers have been bringing forward those sites that are available for development as windfall proposals, then there has to be a question about deliverability moving forward.
Thank you. Ms. Allwood, sorry, could you put your boards down if you're so I can see the rest of them? Thank you very much. Ms. Allwood.
Thank you. We've just got a quick comment or query on the status of neighbourhood plans in as a source of housing supply. Policy CP2C is worded to set out a number of means to deliver new housing, which includes neighbourhood plans. It's not very clear in that whether that is an additional source of supply or whether that falls under the umbrella of CP21, which talks about permitting development proposals within defined settlement boundaries. If it's not an additional source of supply, we would suggest that neighbourhood plans should perhaps be referred to in CP1 along with the local plan.
Sorry, where are you talking about CP1?
CP2C1, sorry.
In what context is that? What's CP? What is that reference?
Policy CP2 in the local plan.
SP2?
Sorry, SP2.
And sorry, just to clarify, then now I know where you're talking about. What is your concern that it should reflect?
Policy SP2 C4 in the neighbourhood plans is under essentially the umbrella of SP2 C1 in terms of permitting development proposals within settlement boundaries, but not an additional source of housing supply. We would suggest that neighbourhood plans is referred to in C1. And the relevance of this point to be that when we discuss steps trajectory in issue 2, put your microphone on, please.
Sorry, are you saying that that point 4 should be part of C1 because anything in a neighbourhood plan would need to be within settlement boundaries?
If it's not supposed to be an additional source of supply, yes.
And why would that matter? Why does it matter if they're just listed separately?
I think when we go on to discuss step trajectories keeps turning itself off. When we go to discuss step trajectories in issue 2, we, as we have in our hearing statements, make reference to other local plan examinations where the importance of neighbour plans or DPDs has been considered by an inspector for delivery of housing in the short term.
Thank you. Mr. Burley.
Thank you. I'd like to raise issue with the density of particularly smaller sites, which of course is key to the immediate delivery in the early years of the plan period. We've looked at the council's planning records and trawled through them and tried to match up current applications or recently decided applications over the past year or so with the local plan, and we've set out the examples we found on page 5 of our hearing statement. And you'll see from that that whilst the local plan estimates 51 dwellings, the actual yield was 33. Quite a big difference. And looking at site LOU stop R10, for example, in Loughton, the local plans estimated that to have a capacity for 12 homes, but the planning officer's report said that a scheme for 9 dwellings was too big, and planning permission was refused. And it's ended up that I think the existing dwellings have been refurbished. So I think there's quite a lot of scope on smaller sites because it is quite difficult to predict the actual capacity. It's not the case where on a greenfield site one can use a standard density across a large area. So I think that that could potentially be an issue in terms of delivery in the early years. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Neame.
Thank you. Just on windfalls, I'd like to wholeheartedly support and endorse Mr. Bolton's points. They were all exactly the points that I wish to make. The compelling evidence issue is the key there. Just a small point in terms of the contribution of specialist forms of housing. I'm grateful for the clarification that Mr. Coleman gave regarding the specific site reference that you had noted in your agenda, Madam. And I think I noted correctly that he said that that is not part of the council's supply. It is, as you will note from the Appendix 3 of our matter statement, it is included in the council's supply. There is also an additional site currently being progressed for C2 use, included in the council's supply as well. So I'd be grateful if, perhaps to assist you as part of the updates from this session, that the supply is updated to reflect both of those sites.
Which is the other one?
So the other one is LOU.R3. Both sites identified in the council's evidence as being pursued for a C2 use. You'll note that we have identified a series of other sites which fail similarly the footnote 12 test, but I won't go through those now. I'll deal with those when we come on to issue 2, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stebbing.
Thank you, Madam. I'll be brief. This is on Ongar, pages 134, 135, and inset map 5.8, which is overleaf, and you might just care to have a look at that. My clients have an interest in site R2, which is part of the West Ongar concept framework area. We entirely support the council's approach on that concept area. Don't share the concerns, I'm afraid, of Ms. Dadd of the Neighbourhood Plan Steering Group. Preliminary work we've undertaken does indicate that we can achieve in the region of 135 homes on site R2 without any significant adverse effects upon the character of that part of Ongar. And I don't know if you've been yet to view any of those sites. It is clearly close to the Four Wants roundabout, major node in Ongar's spatial network, highly sustainable site. And therefore we support the council entirely on the approach they're adopting here. We can comply with policies SP3 DM10 and what is laid out in P4, and invite you to endorse the allocation, Madam. Thank you.
clues.
Thank you, thank you. What I'd like to just ask you about, and particularly ask the council about, is that okay? Is the volume okay? Yes. Is about the specialist housing again and the supply of specialist housing. Now, I might end up jumping around because I didn't quite expect the council's response to be what it was, but in essence, there's no real commentary on the specialist housing in the council's hearing statement. So the response today was very helpful, and I appreciate the housing forum just commented on this as well about the supply. My concern is that there isn't really, the C2 does not form a part of the supply for the housing. However, it does form a part of the monitoring for the supply of accommodation, because that's in Appendix 3 in relation to particularly SP1. I know we talked through Appendix 3 and the monitoring of different applications, but it includes specialist accommodation. One must assume that includes institutional accommodation in C2. Now, the council commented that the reason it doesn't include the supply of specialist accommodation is because of the SHMA, the 2015 SHMA, and they made some references there. Now it's EB 405. I believe the council commented on paragraph 6.21 as the reasons for not including it. Now, if I can just read the bit that the original emphasis is in bold in the report itself. So this is the pertinent points from the report on older persons accommodation in particular. And it says, on the basis of the ageing population, if bed spaces in residential institutions in C-class are counted within the housing supply, then the increase in institutional population over 75 or over would need to be counted as a component of the housing requirement also. Now, as far as I can tell, it is included in the supply, so it really should have been included in the need also. If it hasn't been, then there needs to be robust policies which seek to address that need. Now, what's more interesting is that the objectives of the plan, if you go back to the very first, I think it's page 20, the objectives of the plan, objective B2, includes the fact that the council will seek to include supported housing for elderly people and groups requiring specialist needs. Now, there are two things there. One is that we feel that the plan really does need to identify sites for specialist accommodation, otherwise it will not come forward. But the policies that the council have put forward that apparently address that need are simply not going to be effective in doing so. And both of those things need to be corrected in order to be compliant with the MPPF and the PPG. I won't go through everything that's in our hearing statement because it is quite succinctly put in terms of references to the PPG and the MPPF within that. But if you're going to include it in the monitoring, then really we do need to see sites meeting that requirement as well. But more importantly, to actually identify what the level of need is in the first place. Now, the 2015 SHMA suggested that it could be excluded from the housing need, provided there are robust policies to meet that otherwise. Now, it's clear from the 2017 SHMA that that specialist accommodation for older people was not included any later on. The uplift in the figure is always to the 41,600 across the SHMA area, not to any figure including older persons. And in fact, it does list the issues that were included as updating the SHMA, and it doesn't include the institutional accommodation. As I say, this is probably bouncing around a little bit, and I guess ultimately the question for the council is really, is there actually are they convinced that the supply of specialist accommodation, particularly for older persons, and the C2 accommodation is actually going to be met through this plan, and how will that be met? Part of our concern for the policies that do try to address it, which as far as we can tell is simply H1, is that although it supports institutional accommodation, it has a part E, supports the need for specialist accommodation, that simply would not outweigh Greenbelt policy, for example. And if you do support specialist accommodation on sites that are identified for general housing, then of course you're going to reduce the other forms of housing that would have otherwise been delivered on those sites. We must presume that the council have exhausted all of their urban sites, they've exhausted all the appropriate sites that could come forward for accommodation generally, and have set out the plan accordingly. Now, we simply can't see how C2 accommodation is going to come forward without reducing the need, the provision of other forms of accommodation. So therefore, sites really should have been identified that were suitable for that in the first place. I think that's my So I appointed us again.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Bryan.
Thank you. Although I'm here today for Mr. Eldred, Saunders also represent Site R1, the landowners of Site R1 in Ongar, which is the in the West Concept Framework area, along with Mr. Stebbing's site. First of all, I just want to concur with him that it is in accordance with policy SB3 and achievable, but also want to highlight a sort of anomaly which would welcome a main modification on, which I hope will go some way to address Mrs. Dadd's concerns. Policy P4 refers to approximate housing numbers for all of the allocations, including R1 and R2. But Appendix 6, which the Council have stated they intend to have policy status, says minimum only for the West Concept Framework area. I think the other sites in Ongar, it says approximate again, I think. But yes, so there's if the appendix could be amended to approximate in accordance with the policy, that would probably at least clarify things. Thank you.
Mr. Ireland.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a short point that sort of almost develops on what Mr. Bolton said regarding windfalls, which is that paragraph 48 in the framework, as he says, requires compelling evidence, and there are almost two components to what it says. It requires compelling evidence, firstly, that windfall sites have consistently been available in the local area, and then secondly, that they will continue to provide a reliable source of supply. And therefore, I think an approach which is looking just backwards doesn't fundamentally deal with the second component of the requirement for compelling evidence that is set out, which is a forward-looking approach to confirm that it will continue to provide a reliable source of supply in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask the Council to come back on a few of those points. If you just give me a moment to pick those up. Okay, thank you. The first relates to the density assumptions that have been made in the plan, and particularly in relation to the allocated sites. So we've heard from Mr. Shah that there is a planning permission with a higher density on Chigwell R11. Would the Council need to update? The general question is, is there a need to update any of the allocations and the density assumptions in light of emerging evidence from planning applications? That's the general question. And obviously, first of all, there's one that's sort of potentially resolved through the planning application process. And then Mr. Burley's point was slightly different, perhaps in that there's potential for a higher level to have been assumed on some of the smaller sites, and I think in relation to R10 in Loughton, he said that it's been refused on the basis that the density in the local plan was too high. So the general question is, should updates be made due to evidence emerging from planning applications either way, whether it's higher or lower?
The simple answer, Madam, is no.
Right.
The work has been undertaken consistently to assess sites and their capacity. It's never going to be a perfect science, and there will be occasions where densities achieved or capacity achieved at a planning application may be less than the allocation, but in many cases it will be more, because the approach is appropriate in terms of assessing capacity, and we don't anticipate that it will be inaccurate on the whole. So I don't think it's appropriate to reflect site capacities based on emerging evidence associated with planning applications clearly, once a site has received planning permission, if it gets consent for a particular number, that becomes a commitment in the supply, and that will be reflected in the plan as a commitment. Would also indicate that there are instances that we're aware of where planning applications have come in to the council with a higher number than the number set out in the local plan. So I think the evidence we have suggests it goes both ways, but on the whole, that the approach is absolutely appropriate and we wouldn't want to change it. I think it's worth acknowledging as well that there are a large number of allocations, 90 odd allocations in the plan, going down to a small level. So it's inevitable that the capacity won't be right on every single site.
Thank you. The second point related to the points that have been raised in relation to specialist housing. First of all, we've heard from Mr. Neem about a couple of specific sites that are being pursued for C2 use. So the same question, I suppose, therefore applies. Is there a need to revise the assumptions in the plan, in the knowledge that they're being pursued for alternative uses? We do that first.
So I think clearly where a site has planning permission for a use that isn't C3, then that will need to be reflected in the final supply in the plan. Until it has planning permission, I don't think it's appropriate to make changes. We do acknowledge that there are, as we've said, the schemes coming forward, the couple of schemes coming forward, which could result in C2 uses, and that they may therefore have to be taken out of the C3 supply. But the sites that are allocated for housing uses in the plan are allocated for C3 use, essentially, and therefore I wouldn't anticipate that there will be a very large number of further instances where that would occur. So to answer your question, I think it is right. Clearly, once those sites have planning permission for a non-C3 use, that is reflected in the supply, but it's not going to make a material difference to the housing supply position overall.
How about if you ask that question in the context of the deliverability test in the MPPF as to whether it's available now with a realistic prospect, I assume, for delivery of the type of development proposed? If you're being told already that it's not going to come forward for the use that you've allocated it for, is it meeting the test of deliverability?
I think we'd have to look on that on a case-by-case basis to be absolutely sure. But obviously,
But you can in relation to those two examples that have been put, can't you? I mean, I appreciate that you can't for the whole list necessarily. You don't want to just assume that you've been told in those two cases.
But situations can change as well. There is sometimes a fine line between what constitutes C2 and what constitutes C3, and sometimes a judgment actually has to be made to define whether it's a C2 or C3 use. Sometimes that judgment can't be made until later in the planning application process. Okay. So I don't know the individual details of the cases, but I think we would want to be very cautious about suggesting a change at this stage before planning permission has been granted, before we know for sure that it's not a C3 use.
Thank you. And then coming to the point raised by Mr. Clues, I don't know whether you feel it's an appropriate place for you to discuss that now or under the session for H1, but his question essentially was, does or should the plan identify a specific need for specialist accommodation, and will that need be met? Which I think is a valid question.
I'm happy to address that now.
Okay.
And certainly, Mr. Clues raised reference again to the SHMA quite correctly. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the SHMA does indicate the need for institutional housing, and it indicates a need of 1,733 persons over the planned period across the entire housing market area. That's EB 405, the same reference I gave you previously. So the council is confident that that need can and will be met, as already, I don't have the figures, but I would anticipate it is largely met already across the entire housing market area. There are a number of ways that the need can and will be met through the local plan. there is the site in Chigwell R4, is actually allocated for C2 use. In addition, policy H1 Part C does give backing to C2 development where schemes comply with relevant policy requirements. Importantly, the plan also makes clear that strategic developments should include a mix of homes and housing provision for an ageing population. So policy SP4 Part C little 10, little x, requires garden town communities to provide a mix of homes, including housing provision for an ageing population. It's also important to recognise that special accommodation needs across the district, including housing for older people, can be provided in a number of different ways other than just pure C2 development. So care can be provided through a C3 use. So the fact that it's allocated for C3 doesn't mean it can't provide a function for providing for older people's needs. So we are confident that there are a range of ways in which the plan will provide for the needs identified in the SHMA. Indeed, they may already been provided for, particularly given the number equates to the entire housing market area.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you wanted to come back on other than those points?
Yes, there is actually one further point, Madam. In terms of windfall, heard several times around the table about compelling evidence to support the council's position. Just with reference to the annual monitoring reports, I think it's important to note that there are, well, I mentioned earlier that the local plan allocates for sites of 6 or more units, which will inevitably cut down the sources of windfall supply for the remainder of the plan period, hence the reduced number down to 35 per annum. But with reference to previous AMRs, there is clear evidence of sites with a capacity of 5 or less coming forward over recent years. So in the most recent monitoring year, 2017-18, there was 180 units on sites with a capacity of 5 or less. The previous year, 2016-17, 106 units. Previous year, 2015-16, 51 units. 2014-15, 71 units. And 2013-14, 70 units. So if you average out those recent rates, it comes up to almost 100 units a year, which is obviously well in excess of the 35. Thank you.
There was one final point I had on my list, was the point made by Ms. Bryan about the difference between it saying approximate units in the plan itself and minimum in Appendix 6. She suggested that they should be consistent, which is one point, but which way should they be consistent?
I think it would be appropriate for them to be minimum in light of the wider approach of the plan and the need to give enough flexibility to the housing supply. That's certainly the intention, recognising that there may be instances where, as we've heard, sites do come in for a lower capacity when detailed planning applications come forward, but we don't expect that to be a regular occurrence.
So that wouldn't address Miss Dadd's concern in the way that you suggested, Miss Bryan. But you can see why the council.
No, my suggestion was that it should be approximate.
Yeah, I realise that. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think that concludes our discussion of issue 1. It's probably an appropriate time for a break now, and then we'll come back and discuss issue 2. So if we come back at just after 1:30. Thank you. Bolton has his board up.
Just a quick point of clarification on the windfall figures we were given. Can the council come back to you at some point to confirm whether they were net or gross? Because I couldn't find that data in EB 1708M, which is the annual monitoring report. I believe it's in their database, it's not in their published data. So confirmation of where the figures are and net or gross would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn to issue 2. First of all, though, it's got warm again in here. It was very warm yesterday, so if anyone feels the need to take off their jacket, please don't be shy. So turning now to issue 2, will the plan ensure that there is a reasonable prospect of a 5-year land supply being achieved upon adoption and throughout the lifetime as the plan as required by paragraph 47 of the MPPF? I think, given a few things that's been said this morning, we should change the order very slightly of what's on the agenda. So first of all, if we could discuss the appropriate 5-year period, which is the issue that was raised by Mr. Neame. Now, my understanding is that the council considers it should be 2018-19 to 2022-23, and that's the basis for the information in their statement. Whereas Mr. Neame is arguing that it should be moved on by a year. So if we could we'll discuss that first, before then moving on to, I'd like some clarification of the remaining requirement for the plan period, what the annualised requirement would be, what it would be with a 5% buffer, what it would be with a 20% buffer, before we then move on to the bullet point on my agenda, which is the justification for the step trajectory. So that's the order. We'll then talk about that, the step trajectory, then the buffer, and then the last 3 sub-points. So we'll take it in that order, and people will get a turn around the table for each of those sort of subsets, if you like. So if we could begin, first of all, with the 5-year period. I don't think I need to hear from the council on that. We understand the council's position. So if anyone is saying that we should be considering the 2019-20 onwards 5-year period, if we could hear from them. So if we start with Mr. Neame.
Yes, thank you, Madam. I mean, I think it is simply an elaboration on the point I wish to make on the point I made earlier. And it stems quite rightly, I think, from your question, which in turn stems from paragraph 47 of the framework, which is, will the plan ensure that there is a reasonable prospect of a 5-year land supply being achieved upon adoption of the plan and throughout the lifetime of the plan? The point being that the plan will be adopted, if all goes well for the council, within the monitoring year that commences 1st of April 2019, which is less than 2 weeks from where we stand now. So I think from your point of view, Madam, you need to be furnished with sufficient evidence to understand what that 5-year supply position would be at that base date. To proceed on the basis that the council is inviting you to do would be to do so on the basis of out-of-date evidence, in effect. You'll note from the appendices that we have supplied in our matter statement, particularly Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, we have translated the council supply data into a rolling 5-year supply position, so you can see both forwards and reverse of the April 2019 base date what the 5-year supply position would be on an annual basis. But I really do think that has to be the starting point. If we have a debate on the 2018 base date, which as I understand it is the council's position in as much as their monitoring runs up to the 31st of March 2018, so they would be inviting you to consider the 5-year period commencing from the 1st of April 2018. That is a year out of date.
And so how today do we discuss your solution, given that we don't have the next year's monitoring data?
For the purposes of our discussion today, the only realistic way that we can deal with that is to use the data that the council has supplied, which is its projected delivery from commitments, and then it applies a 10% lapse rate to that, and that is effectively the total supply that the council relies on for that monitoring year in any event. so that there is an element of flexibility, if you like, built into the council's figure there. So that gives, in terms of the figures that the council have cited, they have a commitment figure of 533 dwellings expected to be completed in the period 2018-2019, of which they then apply a 10% lapse rate, which removes 53 units and gives you a total of 480, which is not too far removed from the figure of 526, which is the figure from the last corroborated completion figures. So I would suggest that we can have a debate and a discussion using that figure, and that the council have already indicated to you that they would be in a position to give you a corroborated figure certainly by the end of the year, and I would have thought they'd be able to do that before then. But looking to perhaps where our timeline may be, that they have several months between now and the conclusion of main modifications consultation, for example, which is where that figure would need to be inserted into the plan to be able to provide that data. But I think it's a safer position for you to work from that base date, because otherwise we're in a position where we're working a year out of date.
Could the council comment on that, and could you also comment on the practicality of that for today's session? Are there things that you would need to do to be able to have the discussions on that basis, such as producing another table and another step trajectory?
In short, yes. There's the practical requirements of the monitoring itself. There's also the work to produce an updated trajectory and potentially refine the stepped approach. So it took quite a considerable amount of time to put together the housing implementation strategy update. So we've essentially already done it once. I don't think it would be reasonable to do it again for the purposes of a discussion that we're having today, which is before the end of the monitoring year period. So things change, you know, inevitably the monitoring could always be theoretically updated, but I think we have to work with the information we have. And for us to commit to going away to produce another round of monitoring data plus an update to the document, I think, well, it's very difficult for us to do that in the near future.
Okay, well, it takes my question is, for the purpose of today's discussion, is it reasonable? Can you foresee any great difficulties with having a discussion today based on the step trajectory before us? And then, obviously, if as a result of the conversation today, I feel that the council needs to update its information, then I can request that it does so, and that will be made available through at least the modifications process. Because I do understand what you're saying, but also it's not just a matter of rolling it forward. So they say they've based their trajectory on the information that they have, and I can see us having to go away and let them sit there and work out the simple figures, let alone all the more complicated figures that sit behind it. And I think that could actually take some time. How do people feel about that? Can I ask Mr. Neame to comment on that, and then I'll take the two other points here.
I mean, clearly, Madam, we can have a discussion on the 2018 base date. Our evidence, as I've said, gives you a 5-year supply calculation from 2011 every year, right the way through to the end of the plan period. So I'm entirely happy to do that. If you would indulge me in terms of occasional references to the 2019 base point, that would be appreciated.
Mr. Brent.
Thank you, Ma'am. I'd agree with Mr. Neame really in terms of the taking it forward on that basis, but I think it's not too uncommon across plans for the consideration to be given to the adoption point at which the 5-year land supply is considered, and I think a lot of councils do actually look at that part of the equation within their 5-year land supply. So it's not a significant move away from what practice is in terms of considering five-year land supply at such hearings. So I don't think it is a significant amount of work. And I think as Mr. Neam's evidence shows, and we've looked at ourselves in terms of the data, it is possible to look at it with regard to what the assumptions are with delivery. It doesn't necessarily have to be the precise form of delivery, recognising that each year things will change over time anyway. So I think it is just a pragmatic approach to understanding what that five-year supply will be on adoption, rather than just on past data.
Mr. Bolton.
Yes, I'm just supporting what Mr. Neame says. Appendix 1 is where you need to look in his submissions on this, and they set out the calculation of the five-year land supply using the council's approach, 20% buffer, Liverpool, and that gives you the five-year land supply through the period of the plan. So the work's been done in effect. What the level of debate, therefore, is how good are the accounts at predicting completions in this year that's just gone, which is a different debate which we'll go on to, but the work's there. So we can discuss both the council's date, the suggested date, and of course, as your question intends, the supply throughout the whole period of the plan.
Well, what we'll do then is if we... I said to you that I wanted some clarification at the outset about the remaining requirement for the period, and then what it would be annually, what it would be with the 5% and 20% buffer. If I ask the council to give me its figures based on now, and Mr. Neame, you can give me your figures from your Appendix 1, and then as we proceed through the discussion, we'll have both before us. Mr. Taylor.
Madam, we also support the submission that's been made about the use of 2019 20 as the baseline. The key is indeed to focus on whether there is a five-year housing land supply as at the date of adoption. And not to get too legal on you, and forgive me for this, but there is actually some helpful case law, a case called Stratford upon Avon and the Secretary of State from 2013, reference EWHC 2074 admin. This is the decision of Mr. Justice Hickinbottom in the early days of paragraphs 47 to 49 of the MPPF, in which he explained that when you take a decision whether to grant planning permission or not, and you look at whether there's a five-year housing land supply, you look at whether that supply exists at the date of the decision. And so if you do not use the date of adoption as the focus for considering the five-year housing land supply, you use an earlier year, there's a danger that the very day after adoption, a decision maker has to come to the conclusion that there isn't a five-year housing land supply. And so I would suggest that in order to avoid that, frankly, absurd position, there is an obvious need for a focus on the date of adoption as the beginning of the five-year housing land supply.
Okay, thank you. Does the council want to give its final view before we move on?
Only to restate really the previous position. I think it's there's always a lag in terms of the end of the monitoring year and when you can make data available. It's both a practical and resource issue, but it takes time, and I can assure everyone that an awful lot of work has gone into formulating the trajectory and the stepped approach. It's not as simple as necessarily rolling forward the figures. And I think given that we are in a position sat here today where we're not even in April, we're still in the monitoring year, it's very difficult to see how we can consider anything other than the data that we put forward. Although I appreciate that the plan will be adopted in the next monitoring year. I'm not sure there's an awful lot more I can add other than to also say that the council has carefully considered the amount that the housing supply and the step trajectory to make sure that there is sufficient room for manoeuvre should things change slightly. So for the purposes of the discussion today, we're not saying that we will end up with a 5.1 year land supply. You know, we have taken into account that things will need to change, and I'm confident that there will be a 5-year land supply on adoption of the plan, and that the evidence that's available demonstrates that.
Might I just add, Madam, in respect of the Stratford case, Mr. Taylor was absolutely right to note that that's a case, certainly as I recall, that related to the decision-making context. I confess I haven't read it recently, but it's undoubtedly the case that the decision maker should be taking account of the position as at the date of decision in that context, in other words, the decision-making context, on the best evidence available. And that's what we're doing today. Undoubtedly, we are considering the position based upon the council's evidence, which is the evidence that is being tested at this examination. It's the best evidence. Whether or not in due course you think it appropriate to ask us to update is a matter for you.
Thank you. Okay. So if we can move on now to the remaining, I just want some clarity over the remaining requirements. Now, as I said, if you want to give me your alternative figures, then I can have both before me. And it may be that I ask the council to update it at a later date, but we have the figures before us, which are the figures I've been looking at as well, and so it would be useful, I think, to not just disregard those for now. So, is the council able to say what the remaining requirement for the plan period is as it sees it, which would be 2018-19 to 32-33, and see if I have the same figure?
Yes, Madam. So if I can refer you to Appendix 1 of the Housing Implementation Strategy Update. That's EB 410B. There is a table there, a summary table, which I think provides the details that you're looking for. So,
Appendix B, did you say?
sorry. Apologies, 410A. I think I said B, sorry. And it's page 16.
Okay.
So within the table, there's the different sources of supply and also the requirements, and it shows you total housing supply, 13,103 dwellings, and then going down further, the annualised requirement totals up to the plan requirement of 11,400, and then the row below that, the second from bottom row, shows the future housing requirement, which is 9,544 homes. So that is essentially 11,400 minus completions of 1,856. Completions from the start of the plan period up until 2017-18.
And so on an annualised basis, I've got the same figure, so I'm in the right place. So the annualised requirement, not taking account of any buffer, would be 636 dwellings per annum, is that right? Which is basically 9,544 divided by 15.
I haven't got that figure in front of me, but that sounds right.
Okay.
The requirement with a buffer of 5% is set out in the second from bottom row of the table.
668.
For the
668.
For the first 5 years, then
Yeah.
reducing to 620.
Okay, so it would be 668 with a 5% buffer. Is that right? Yep.
Yes.
And then my calculation shows it would be 763 with a 20% buffer. If it was averaged over the remaining plan period, obviously not taking account of the step trajectory, I just think it's useful to have those figures, because obviously then when we come on to the steps, we can see how they compare to what it would be if you just had an annualised requirement.
I have got, I don't wish to cause confusion, I've got some different figures here that may be helpful. Not different in terms of the outcome, but just different barometer, really. So if you apply the Liverpool approach and a 20% buffer, the 5-year requirement is for 3,818 dwellings.
Yep.
If you apply the Sedgefield approach with a 20% buffer, the 5-year requirement is 5,235 dwellings. Sorry, I can just confirm, hopefully to give you some comfort. So the annual requirement under the Sedgefield approach with a 20% buffer results in an annual requirement of 1,047 dwellings per annum for the first 5 years of the plan period.
That's with a
20% buffer.
What was the figure?
1,047. That would then drop down for the latter years of the plan period to 431.
Don't worry too much for now. Where are you taking those figures from? If you, I think for me, I just wanted to see what it would. We know you're not proposing the Sedgefield approach. I was just looking. I want to be able to compare your step trajectory with what it would be if you just averaged it out for now. And so I think, having heard your figures for the remaining requirements and the 5-year requirement on the Liverpool approach, I think we've got the same figures, so that's okay. So I'm fairly clear on that. Did Mr. Neem or anyone else want to say what you think it would be if we took a year on?
Just to deal with each of the points really quickly, I'm eternally grateful that I have the same mathematics in terms of the completion figures and the residual requirement, therefore, for the remainder of the plan period, so over the total complete agreement there. I am in complete agreement with the majority of the figures given, but I think there was just one discrepancy, and I may have misheard. The Liverpool 20% 5-year requirement was quoted at 3,818. I think that was actually taken from the 2017-18 monitoring year. It should be 3,885. That then gets you to the annual requirement, which I make to be 777 with Liverpool 20%.
For what it's worth, I made it 3,815, which could be due to rounding, but it was closer to the council's figure, which was basically 11,400 minus 1,856 equals 9,544, divided by 15 equals 636 per annum, times by
I have those
5.
I have those exact mathematics, but they sit just in the year earlier. That's all. The only point I make. But I reached that figure. I follow the mathematics, and as per the Sedgefield method, we are exactly on par. The mathematics are identical. I've got exactly the same figure.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Right. Okay. Well, I can check the mathematics. I think it might be useful if the council can produce a table that shows various scenarios, but I can ask for that afterwards. I think for the basis of this hearing, I've got enough of an idea of how far below the step trajectory is of those requirements. Following our discussion, I will ask the council to just produce some sort of table that clarifies the point, but that's okay. Okay, thank you. Mr. Neem, did you want to say anything about the figures on the basis of the 1920? Is it helpful at this stage for you to point that out, or at least to point out what the remaining requirements would be?
Well, just to confirm that last point first, the remaining requirement would be so we have the 1,856, which is the completion figure, and then using the council's figure, you would then add to that 480 dwellings. So that's the proposed commitment completion minus the 10% lapse rate that the council apply. So that would give you then, just on the quick mathematics, 2,336, hopefully we're all agreed. And you would then take that from the 11,400, which gives you 9,064. In terms then of the first question last, the two tables that we've reproduced at Appendix 1 and 2 of our statement, as I said, set out what the rolling position is relative to Liverpool 20% and Sedgefield 20%. Those are the two scenarios that are rehearsed in those detailed tables. So in the 2019-20 monitoring year, Liverpool 20%, if I just give you the headline figure in terms of supply in years, because you can turn to that section and see the figures, is 4.4. This is all based on a static requirement, I might add, of 518 dwellings per annum, so no step in the...
You were saying they'd have a 4.4 year...
4.4.
Supply?
Correct, yes. That compares then, if you apply the Sedgefield method, it drops to 2 years exactly. And just going back to the point that I made at the outset, if you look at the Liverpool position, the year that the council wants to pursue in this discussion, that's the 2018 year, gives you 3.6 years, which hence my point that if you actually look forward, you are in a slightly better position.
Okay. Right. Okay. Okay.
Actually, can I just make a very quick correction and apology? The 2 years is based on the adjustments that we've made to supply. My apologies, so I need to keep them static. With the council supply, it's 3.3 years. So Sedgefield 20%, 3.3 years. The 2 years relates to the forum supply, but clearly we'll come on to that in discussion.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, we'll move on now to how the council has created its trajectory. So I do want to discuss the justification for the proposed step trajectory, and as you go through, if you could provide your justification for the value, perhaps, of each of the steps, and also address those two square bullet points on my agenda, which is the extent of reliance upon large strategic sites. And you've talked a bit today already about the use of smaller sites in the trajectory, but if you could just be clear. And I guess, given everything that we've heard in previous sessions and the nature of this, the step trajectory, whichever figures we take, you can see that the steps for the five-year period upcoming are obviously quite a long way below the annualised requirements, whether you then take the Sedgefield or Liverpool approach, or a 5% or a 20% buffer. The stepped approach is a lot lower. So in that context, and in the context of everything that we've heard in other sessions about the requirement and the OAN and the site selection process, I'm just looking, I guess, to give the council an opportunity here to give a really clear justification for why it isn't possible to allocate more smaller sites to boost early supply. And people have made reference to the outcome or the inspector's comments in relation to the Guildford examination. It'd be useful to have your view on that. So I'll stop there for now anyway, and let the council begin, and then we'll go around the table on that.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, I'll be pleased to provide you with that. So in terms of a justification for the step trajectory and the bullet points you've raised on the agenda, I'd like to start by saying that there is a very comprehensive justification for the use of the stepped trajectory. in the Housing Implementation Strategy Update. And as you know, that's EB 410A. If I start with larger sites, for large strategic sites, which we've taken to be sites requiring a strategic master plan, they will provide a minimum of 6,794 new homes in total, which represents 52% of the total housing supply over the plan period. Only a small amount of those homes are anticipated to be delivered within the next 5 years. For smaller allocations, the timescales for delivery are based on the assumptions set out in Table 1 of EB 410A, and that's page 22. I think it's important to stress that 63 out of 91 of the allocations in the plan are for less than 50 units, and the vast majority of those will be delivered within the next 5 years. For sites with planning permission commitments, the vast majority are expected to be delivered in their entirety within the next 5 years. And as we've heard, a 10% non-implementation rate is applied to those to ensure flexibility. It is important to acknowledge the scale of the challenge that's posed to the Council in seeking to address housing need, and particularly address the historic shortfall, the accrued shortfall from the start of the plan period. Theoretically, if the Council sought to apply the Sedgefield approach, together with a 20% buffer, as we've just discussed, it would require 1,047 homes to be delivered every year for the next 5 years. That is more than double the annualised housing requirement of 518 homes per year. It's also approximately 4 times the number of the Council's historic delivery rate, which is at approximately 250 homes per annum. So the Housing Implementation Strategy Update clearly explains why achieving those figures is not feasible, nor is it possible. It is not possible for the Council to allocate more sites, more smaller sites in the plan. And this has been discussed at previous sessions, but I will just outline again why that is the case. Firstly, the Council has sought to include sites which will contribute positively towards the 5-year supply as far as appropriate through the site selection process. And if I provide you with a reference, in the site selection report at EB 805, page 45, paragraph 2.131. However, in reaching a judgment about which sites to allocate, the Council has had to balance a range of other factors, most notably the impact of growth on Epping Forest, special area of conservation, and the impact of growth on the district's infrastructure, including the transport network. The Council considers that the local plan submission version represents a finely balanced package, which does achieve net gains across the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, as required by paragraph 152 of the NPPF. Furthermore, there is clearly significant public interest in the Council adopting an up-to-date plan as soon as possible. The need to reconsider the site allocations within the plan would result in a considerable delay, requiring the Council to undertake significant amounts of additional technical work and further discussion with neighbouring authorities. This delay would exacerbate the housing challenges that the Council is currently facing, including addressing the housing shortfall that has accrued since the beginning of the plan period, and the need to accelerate delivery rates. So, the local plan and the Housing Implementation Strategy Update does set out a pragmatic approach which seeks to allocate a sufficient quantum of development in order to achieve a 5-year housing supply in the first phase, that's 2018-19 to 2022-23, and sets a realistic step targets thereafter. Importantly, the approach exceeds the overall housing requirement for the district over the plan period. In terms of you asked for clarity on the 5-year steps in the trajectory. And we've gone to great lengths to calculate what we would put forward as being an appropriate and realistic approach, recognising the circumstances. So step 1, I am referring here to page 7 of the Council's Matter 6 statement. Step 1 is essentially the early years of the plan period. And it's common practice in terms of the overall approach that the Council is taking to set the requirement for the early years to equate to what has actually happened on the ground. It's a logical approach. So that provides a target for 265 homes per annum, which is obviously largely irrelevant in the case of that time period having passed. That will help to ensure that the local plan then does deliver the target over the remaining plan period, but also that it's realistic. The step 2 is years 1 to 5. And that provides a requirement at 425 new homes per annum. That's overall 2,125 new homes for the 5-year period. We consider that to be a realistic and achievable target, which would provide more than adequate 5-year land supply upon adoption of the plan in 2019. We estimate, or we calculate it to be 6.2 years, taking into account paragraph 47 of the NPPF and the application of a 5% buffer. If a 20% buffer is applied, the 5-year requirement will increase to 510 homes per annum, and the Council would still be able to demonstrate 5.4 years of supply. The third and final step is years 6 to 15. So this is for the remainder of the plan period. And that steps to 742 homes per annum during the last 10 years. And that's at the point when the strategic allocations would be delivering significantly. So whilst it's a challenging target, we do believe it's deliverable. Would you like me to go on and address any of the other bullet points now, or stop there?
If you stop there, I think the only thing Sorry, the only thing that you haven't covered is the reference that some people have made to the inspector's findings in the Guildford examination. If you could cover that and then stop.
Thank you, Madam. I won't go into detail, but we do feel that the Guildford case is not directly comparable to the circumstances in this district. So there are different levels of constraints in the two local authority areas, albeit Guildford does have a substantial amount of greenbelt coverage. But we do have, obviously, the special area of conservation to consider in Epping Forest District. The increased housing requirement in this district is also more extreme based on historic data, or historic requirements. So under the East of England plan, Epping Forest District was required to provide 175 homes per annum. Under the new local plan requirement, emerging local plan requirement, that increases to 518 homes per annum. In the case of Guildford, they had a requirement in their previous local plan of 465 homes per annum. And the emerging local plan for Guildford increases to 672. So whilst it's a significant increase, it's not on the same scale as the increase in Epping Forest District. We also are confident that we have undertaken a detailed and thorough site search and assessment process, and that we have included, as we said, a very large number of smaller sites that can deliver at an early stage. Whereas in Guildford, there were less housing allocations in the plan. There are less housing allocations in the plan, only approximately 50. And only around 13 of those have a capacity of less than 50 units, which in total will deliver a smaller number of homes. And that contrasts with the figure I stated earlier in Epping, 63 out of 91 of the allocations in the plan are for less than 50 units. We're also aware, as far as we're aware, the inspector's report has not yet been published for the Guildford local plan examination, so it's difficult to draw any direct conclusions from that.
Okay, I just want to ask a couple of questions before I then take points around the table. And it's really just to sort of push this point again about the justification for why it isn't possible to allocate more sites. Now, I know obviously we've spoken about this in previous sessions, but I just wonder whether you're able to point to some really clear evidence that, say, the SAC issue or the transport and infrastructure limits in this district limit the number of allocations, they'll limit the capacity to the 13,000 or so that you're proposing in the plan, and why any more than that would tip the balance beyond what can be accommodated within those constraints that you've set out.
Thank you, Madam. I don't necessarily have the document reference numbers to hand, but if I talk in a general sense, clearly Epping Forest Special Area of Conservation is a very significant constraint in the district, and I know we'll be coming on to talk about that in more detail. But there are, certainly through the plan-making preparation stages, there have been very significant concerns raised by Natural England and the Conservators of Epping Forest. As a result, the Council has worked very closely with both parties and with other neighbouring authorities to develop a mitigation strategy to demonstrate that the approach of the plan can be sound and to make sure that the housing plan can actually be delivered. And that has been very finely balanced and has involved a great deal of joint working between parties, also including Essex County Council. So there has been significant amount of highways modelling, air quality modelling, and as you know, that has been finely balanced. But we are confident that the habitats regulation assessment that's available now shows that the plan is sound and can be delivered. But we are very conscious that there is a very fine balance to be struck here. We're also aware of concerns that have been raised throughout the plan making process from Essex County Council, particularly in terms of the impacts on the highway network, and also from neighbouring councils, not least Harlow, who have been concerned about the impact of traffic generation on Harlow Town Centre. So we've worked very, very closely with both parties and other neighbouring authorities to develop a package which we feel is appropriate and will allow the plan to be delivered. So there are a number of what I would term fairly critical constraints to growth, which we have sought to address and mitigate throughout the plan making process. And that's required a significant amount of technical work, as you'll be aware, a significant amount of evidence collation, which is partly why it's taken a very long time for the plan to get to this stage. As you also, I'm sure, are aware, at the moment there is essentially a moratorium on planning applications coming forward, being determined as a result of some of the issues I've just discussed. So it's not a case that simply the council could go away and add in more small sites to the plan. We couldn't do that. It's unlikely that any more housing could easily be added, and to add any housing would require a significant amount of additional work in relation particularly to the issues I've just raised. And they're not the only issues, but certainly are very substantial constraints which need to be very carefully considered.
And in light of that, a sort of general question, in light of the implications that the strategy chosen has for the early part of the plan period, within that sort of fixed amount that you can accommodate, is the council still satisfied, having regard to the requirements of the MPPF in terms of early delivery and the focus on early delivery in the 5 years, that the strategy to pursue those larger strategic sites that can't come forward until the end of the plan period is still a better one than to, even if you had to reduce some of those in order to stick within the limit, to boost early delivery with different types of sites?
Yes, absolutely, is the short answer. The larger sites in the plan, as I've mentioned earlier, are a key element, but by no means the only source of supply. They provide critical mass, which is essential to provide for future sustainable communities. They will provide for new schools, health facilities, infrastructure requirements to support the growth planned, which more individual, smaller sites may not. So there's a very comprehensive approach being taken, as you're aware, to planning for infrastructure needs alongside managing the constraints. So reducing the larger sites in favour of smaller sites would not be helpful in that regard. It would also potentially result in a different strategy for the plan. And clearly this plan is, I've mentioned the habitat regulation assessment, but also has been subject to extensive sustainability appraisal work, which has informed the process and supports the approach that the council has taken. So it would potentially result in a different plan to change the strategy and seek to reduce the larger sites. And clearly the Garden Town, Harlow and Gilston Garden Town is a key aspiration and driver for this plan. And the council is working very closely, as you'll be aware, with other partner authorities. So the 3,900 homes coming forward there is seen as crucial for achieving wider aspirations. I should have also, sorry, in terms of the constraints, I think it'd be helpful to refer to the Memoranda of Understanding that the council has agreed with its neighbours across the housing market area in terms of evidencing the approach to dealing with the constraints that exist. So there is evidence of constraints, particularly around Harlow, in terms of the amount of growth that can come forward, but also Epping Forest and the special area of conservation. So the MOUs help to show how the partners are addressing those and showing how the strategic sites will play into the bigger strategy for the area.
Mr. Newton.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a few points about the contribution of strategic sites and the significance of those sites. To take an overview, the Council's Table 2.3 as revised is referring to a total supply of 13,100. And of that, the 3,900 proposed at the Garden Town sites represents less than 30%. Now, I don't think that's an excessive reliance on strategic sites, and indeed other plans have passed the examination process with much higher percentages of strategic sites, and Guildford is an example of that. Also, the Garden Town sites in this plan are actually smaller than the sites which are often associated with long lead-in times, and of course, some detailed work has been done on lead-in times by Litchfield's, formerly NLP, through the Start to Finish report and also in the Letwin report. I think there's a danger of generalisations, really, in terms of a polarisation of small sites being inherently more deliverable and strategic sites less deliverable. There is some validity in that, but I think the important point I want to make is that site-specific considerations are paramount in making that judgment. In this case, another consideration in terms of the emphasis on strategic sites is the spatial strategy, because there's a very strong rationale for major development at Harlow in terms of its contribution to sustainable development and regeneration. Now, I won't rehearse all of that because I think we've been through it on other occasions, but it is something to introduce to the question of the number of strategic sites and the extent of their contribution to overall supply. In terms of the specifics, I would just emphasise with the example of Latin Priory that in that case we're talking about a site in single ownership which is largely unconstrained, and we believe that highways and infrastructure capacity is available for early delivery. So we have provided a trajectory which is set out in paragraph 121 of our statement, which indicates the delivery of 50 units within the 5-year period starting in 2018 and 150 units if that period starts in 2019. Our clients, Hallam Land Management and CEG, have got a very strong record in bringing forward large sites. And I also wanted to emphasise the merits of the Strategic Master Plan process in actually bringing forward large sites. I did refer to this in the Matter 7 hearing. But we've been in constructive dialogue with council officers now over the detail of our proposals for years, in effect, and particularly through an intensive dialogue over the last few months. The Strategic Master Plan process is well advanced. We think it's effective. It can reduce the extent, complexity and duration of the pre- and post-application process. And we're envisaging a very efficient and time-limited process. Now, in paragraph 122 of our statement, which follows the trajectory for the site, we've set out a timeline of how we expect the site to progress, and that does indicate bringing the Strategic Master Plan process to a conclusion this year. We've actually got a second quality review panel meeting on a quite well-advanced master plan in April. And the submission also of a planning application in Q3 of this year. So we are driving this forward. In fact, there's a good deal of work being done by the Latin Priory team in parallel with this EIP process now. And we are expecting rapid progress and early delivery, and that's a key driver for us. Finally, I just wanted to make reference to the discussion we had about the capacity of Latin Priory. And we are today submitting a technical note to you which sets out in detail how we've arrived at the site capacity of 1,500. And that's in response to the question you raised in an earlier session as to whether the capacity of the site had been underestimated. The final point I want to make is that we're very keen for this plan to be adopted. This plan is radical. Although it's come in for a lot of criticism, we're talking here about doubling the rate of housing provision over a period where the rate of provision over many years was suppressed by the fact that Greenbelt remained intact with no revisions to Greenbelt boundary. So it's significant in terms of both of the rate of provision and the fact that it releases significant Greenbelt land with the capacity to deliver thousands of dwellings. So it's a major step forward, and it's one we support, and we want to see the sites implemented, and we want to see the plan adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton.
Thank you. I was going to tackle just the points we were looking at in terms of the justification given by the council. I'll do that, but I will try and comment a little bit on large sites as well, which we cover comprehensively in our submission. First of all, we know a couple of things. We know that the overall target in this plan for housing is well below that which any review will be required to meet in 5 years' time, and that's especially why the plan's been hurried through. And when you acknowledge that to be the case and then start looking at what is now being proposed with a stepped approach, if one was cynical, one would say the stepped approach has been worked out so it mathematically makes sure that paragraph 47 of the current framework, well, the framework we're being judged under, 2012, doesn't bite. You know, it's been calculated to, if you like, put government policy to one side, to avoid it or to neuter the effect. That, I would suggest, has to be looked at in a very cynical manner. And it really is the council not only trying to avoid the emerging commitments to meeting need, but also trying to avoid meeting even its current commitments. And to some extent, that's more pertinent because we are going through a change of the system. And what we know in 5 years' time is that all the backlog which will be built out or built up for the next 5 years, because we are under-providing for the next 5 years, all that will be lost. So it won't be taken into account when you review the plan because you use a standard methodology. So we have a plan that's been put before you which isn't, if you like, necessarily jammed tomorrow. It's effectively how do we take the bread away from the people at the present time. You know, it is about denying people access to housing when they need it. The justification that's been given to you is sparse and doesn't follow the relevant guidance. The relevant guidance is in paragraph 35 of the old or 2012 NPPG. Paragraph 35 says it's quite clear. It says that authorities should aim to produce plans that deal with the undersupply within 5 years where it is possible. And I'll come to that point. But where it is not possible, councils are required to do two things. Or well, they're required to do one thing before they move on to the last step, which is the Liverpool approach. What they're required to do is go to neighbouring authorities, specifically through the duty to cooperate, and say to them, we cannot meet this need within the next 5 years, can you assist us? I've not seen evidence that that's been done specifically. I've seen evidence that they've talked to neighbouring authorities about meeting unmet need in general. I've not seen it specifically to deal with the 5-year issue. And I think you need evidence of that before you can take the stepped approach. In terms of whether it's possible, we've heard yesterday, and indeed before that, there are quite a number of sites which have no constraints in terms of showstoppers. In other words, they pass, if you like, steps 1 and 2, and have been excluded on the grounds of being a policy ground, of being a less preferred strategic location. We're still a little bit at sea at what that actually means, but what we have established is that is something that's been derived from assessments of large areas of land and not the specific sites that have been put to the council. And that leads us on, and just to take a site-specific example, the site south of northwest of North Will Bassett, site of under 300 units, can be some of which could easily be delivered in the next 5 years. It was master planned. It's part of a master plan. No highways problems. Doesn't impact on the SAC, and yet we're being told it is impossible, and that's a term you've got to think, it is impossible to allocate. Clearly it's not impossible to allocate. It wasn't thought impossible by the master planners. It has been excluded on policy grounds, not on any other criteria. So the test in terms of, is it possible to allocate other sites that can assist in meeting the 5-year land supply earlier? Yes, it is certainly possible. What impact that has for larger sites is that those larger sites will, in the future, provide a backbone of supply throughout the length of the plan period and in some cases beyond. And I don't think the increasing number of smaller sites will have a detrimental effect on those. In fact, I think as an area as a whole, it would have a positive impact on affordability and accessibility to housing. Now, do you want me to deal with larger sites, or are we going to come back and deal with strategic sites and their contribution later?
We haven't actually moved on yet, really, from
That's
the
what I
requirements
thought.
rather than the supply, which I think I'll probably do after lunch.
I'm happy to leave it there then.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Belton.
Thank you, Ma'am. I can be quite brief. Mr. Bolton has covered many of my points. You will have seen from our hearing statement that we also don't support the step trajectory. But the place you're in is a difficult one in my view. And if you are to accept a step trajectory, then you need to be convinced that a significant reduction in the annual requirement, particularly on the back of already very low levels of delivery since 2011, really is essential. And to do that, I think you need to satisfy yourself that more sites cannot be delivered. And if you are able to be satisfied that that is the case, that the right sites are then being allocated in the plan. Now, I think, like your question alluded, we haven't been able to find any evidence which suggests what the line is, if you like, in terms of the quantum of growth that can be delivered, whether it be in relation to the SAC or transport impact. And we think that's essential that is made clear if you are being asked to significantly reduce the number of houses that are going to be delivered for the preceding 4 or 5 years. And as you know from our discussions yesterday, we also question, if you do get to that place, that the right sites are being allocated in the plan, because sites that can't deliver early are being favoured over those which can. But my final point sort of touches on paragraph 4.12 of the Council's document EB 410A. And in there, that paragraph, it's grappling with this idea of can the Council allocate more sites to bridge the gap. And the Council says that in the unlikely event that sufficient new sites can be identified, and given the quantum of new allocations that would be needed, we'd need to undertake a lot of substantial new evidence. Well, as we've discussed at many occasions, there are a significant number of sites that the Council have already positively identified, including sites very close to underground stations in locations that the Council's evidence confirms won't have a significant adverse impact on the SAC. So the suggestion that it's questionable whether sites do exist is one that puzzles me. But I have no doubt that there is a pool of sites, including my clients, but others that other people have promoted, which could be drawn upon. And the idea that we really shouldn't go there because it will cause a further delay is, I don't think, sufficient justification for you, because as Mr. Bolton says, this is all about denying people housing. It's a very significant issue and one that we mustn't take lightly.
Thank you. Ms. Allwood?
Firstly, I would concur with some of the previous points that have been made with regards to deliverability of sites, relating as much to the specifics of that site as to the size, and also references to yesterday's Matter 5 discussion on the assessment and availability of additional sites. We've heard reference to the Guildford local plan examination, and I'd just like to also draw reference to the Arran local plan examination, specifically paragraph 88 of the inspector's report from last year, where a step trajectory was allowed in that circumstance, with the inspector commenting that it was recognised delivering a greater range of sites within the local plan, including smaller sites, would have been one way of avoiding a step trajectory. However, this local plan does rely on neighbour plans and non-strategic site DPDs to deliver small allocations just like to highlight that the Epping Forest local plan doesn't include any such alternative mechanism to boost early delivery, and there doesn't seem to be any consideration to it.
Mr Barrett.
Thank you, Ma'am. Again, I suppose, as we all will, probably concur with what's just been said by my colleagues before me. I think it's really just wanting to come back as to, I suppose, why the decision. I think the council have set out in their evidence that it's a pragmatic decision because they don't have a 5-year housing land supply. I think that is based on the decisions and the way they have planned beforehand. There was a clear evidence right at the start at submission where there wasn't a step trajectory in the original plan. There was a flat trajectory. That was a very marginal position. The council should have been aware of that. I would say that marginal position was actually not a marginal position, but it was an unsound, because there wasn't a 5-year housing land supply, because there wasn't a 20% and Sedgefield buffer. A 20% buffer and a Sedgefield methodology should have been used. So the council were aware of that, but they didn't choose to allocate those sites at that stage. They chose to go forward and not to have a pragmatic, effective, an effective plan that looked to deliver and address that backlog within 5 years. They chose not to have that. So going forward, there was a slight delay in the plan as the council in terms of submission, but there can't be much flexibility within a plan that suddenly goes from having a 5-year land supply on the basis of a flat trajectory to one that doesn't have one for that position. It doesn't have the flexibility to cope with that situation. And I think that is a key problem with the plan, coming back to paragraph 14 of the 2012 NPPF in terms of requiring that flexibility. So there are concerns going really from the historic preparation moving through into this plan, which really mean that it wasn't planned properly in the first place to try and address that 5-year supply. I think there were sites, and I think we've discussed, and as people have mentioned, that there are sites that could deliver that supply. I think looking at the Guildford situation, and which has been referred to, the council have mentioned that there aren't any other considerations, that it's just largely greenbelt. There is special protections areas in Guildford. There's A and B. There are other elements within that plan that had to be examined and considered in terms of going forward. Yet within 4 months, they were able to identify additional sites to come forward as part of the main modification. So in terms of the delay, there isn't necessarily has to be a significant delay. It depends on how much the council wants to actually try and address that backlog and try and address those key elements of reducing affordability and improving supply. I think going back to the inspector's interim letter in terms of Guildford is, it's not acceptable. It would negate the purposes of the 20% buffer and frustrate attempts to address key factors affecting worsening affordability and would be contrary to government policy to boost supply. I think those are very key elements that need to be considered in terms of not only does it fit with the 5-year supply and does it take account of that within the backlog within the first 5 years of the plan, but does it actually boost supply and does it improve affordability? And I think those are key elements. I think the council can look to allocate. I think there are examples of that, and it wouldn't have that delay that they're suggesting. It is up to them to decide how much of that delay would be, and they could actually do that quite rapidly and effectively. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Mr Burley.
Thank you. As the last speaker's just said, we are in a policy situation where we're looking to boost supply of homes. And I think that should be at the forefront of this plan, particularly given previous undersupply and particularly given the prospective rate of delivery in future. However, all we've heard from the council is reasons why they can't do things. And the main reason seems to be that they'd need to do some additional work. And I'd ask you to reject that for one simple reason, because if they don't seek to boost supply through this local plan, then all that will happen is the council won't have a 5-year housing land supply, and it'll simply fall back on the argument that development shouldn't be permitted in the Greenbelt. And that will do nothing to improve affordability through increasing supply. I also just want to highlight that the reason given is for not allocating sites is the SAC and other constraints. That's not true. There are other sites. As we've put to you, we have a site that we're promoting on behalf of Quinn Estates, and that has been through statutory consultation on a planning application to show quite clearly that there aren't that type of constraints to delivery. It isn't coming from sour grapes that we say we've been excluded unfairly. It's patently clear that there are inconsistencies in the assessment of our site which have materially affected that. This site is ready to go. I'm not sure that that can be said about many other sites in the local plan, not least given the low rate of planning applications for those sites. This isn't a case where planning applications will come in once a plan's adopted. People are entitled to do that now. They simply aren't. I think there's a wider issue with delivery across this district. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor.
Madam, thank you. Just to build on what Mr. Burley has said there, it's important when you're looking at the step trajectory to bear in mind the MPPF policy approach, the need to significantly boost housing, and of course, really fundamentally in the context of a stepped approach which advocates not meeting OAM. What is said in paragraph 17 in the core planning principles, that every effort should be made to meet needs. That means that in order for a step trajectory that doesn't meet OAM to be justified, and indeed for a plan that doesn't meet needs in the first 5 years to be positively prepared, that you have to be satisfied that every effort has been made to deliver as much housing as possible in the first 5 years, but that simply isn't achievable in the circumstances. Now, it's instructive in that context to look at the way the numbers have played out in the various documents that you have. The submission draft of the plan, December 2017, identified some 4,260 units as deliverable in the first over the 5-year period that we're looking at. You've got in the hearing statement presented on behalf of my client's page. I've written on my page so often, page 5. Where we've got to now with the February 2019 trajectory is some 2,778 units. A little over a year later, some 1,482 units have been cut from the 5-year period. That is, in effect, a loss of some 3 years' supply in little over a year. And what is also instructive is to look at the numbers of completions that we've actually got the data for in the early years of that 5-year period. If you look at the 2017 submission version trajectory, in 2018, some 706 units were anticipated to be delivered for 2018-19. The latest trajectory, we have some 480. For the next year, 2019 to 20, in 2017 submission version, 563, now 371. Significant changes to the current year in terms of what will actually be delivered, and to the next year. Only 12 months on, 13 months on. This is a council that can't even identify what is happening now correctly, never mind what's going forward in the future. And in my submission, that must lead one to be very cautious about accepting the trajectory that's been put forward, and very cautious about accepting it as the basis for establishing that every effort has been made to meet needs in the first 5 years. And the reality here is that this council didn't recognise during the early consultation and development of the plan the issues in relation to the first 5 years that it now finds itself in. It finds itself not delivering the number of units even now that it was anticipated 12 years ago, and we've got no explanation as to why that's the case. Why was the number 706 in the 2017 version, but now we're at 480? What's happened? the houses not been built out? Or have the permissions that were anticipated to be granted not been granted? Or have the applications not come forward? What's the explanation? This plan is flawed in terms of the stepped approach because the council has not made every effort to justify that approach. Indeed, it's only recently come forward as an idea. The plan hasn't pursued a rigorous consideration of doing everything that it was necessary to do to examine whether or not it could meet needs either arising over the first 5 years or backlog. Where, for example, in the site selection process, is there a consideration of the potential need to release greenbelt sites that might deliver in the first 5 years? Which sites, we're told that the real constraints apparently are SACs and infrastructure constraints. Well, if SACs are a constraint, where's the appraisal of where extra SANGs might be identified? If it's infrastructure, what additional infrastructure would be needed to release these other sites? That's the sort of consideration that needs to be given to show that every effort has been made. The key point as well is one, I'm just going to echo Mr. Burley for a moment, is that many sites, particularly greenbelt sites, have been rejected that don't have these sorts of constraints identified in relation to them. They are rejected solely on policy grounds. So where is the appraisal that shows, firstly, which sites were rejected on that basis, and secondly, which justifies that in the context of not being able to meet the needs in the first 5 years on a basis that complies with government policy? What I'm saying is that when you look at all of that, there is no evidence that the approach now advocated in the step trajectory is one that is positively prepared. It was only identified a couple of months ago. It's also not an approach which is justified because there is not sufficient evidence to demonstrate that every effort has been made. Madam, unless there's anything else I can help you with there, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Mr. Neame.
Thank you. A great many of my points have been made, so I won't repeat other than to endorse, but I do just want to deal with a couple of points of clarification for you, particularly in relation to the Guildford example, which we've included within our appendix. I presented land supply evidence at that examination. I'm very familiar with Guildford. I live in Guildford. Just a couple of points in terms of why that was included, why that as an example, and then I'll come back to this plan. The comparable in terms of the constraints, I think it's fair to say actually as a borough, there were a number of constraints omitted from the explanation that Mr. Coleman provided, and just to put some figures to that, 89% of that borough is Greenbelt. In addition to that, the borough is constrained by the Surrey Hills Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, areas of great landscape value, special protection areas, particularly the Thames Basin heaths, special areas of conservation, triple SIs, regional important geological sites, as well as a number of local designations before one enters any heritage assets. So it is a very constrained area, and one might argue more so than Epping. I think you were given some housing figures as well, just in terms of the step up. The correct figure that Guildford has stepped up from was its adopted local plan figure, which is 253 dwellings per annum set from the Surrey structure plan. The step is therefore greater than the 425, I think you were quoted, which was the southeast plan requirement, which of course was never borne out into a development plan. So we have a position where there is direct comparable. You've already been taken to, I think it's our appendix. I can't remember the exact reference, but it's the appendix that contains Mr. Bohr's note, and paragraph 14 in particular that Mr. Barrett took you to. That brings us then across to how that relates to this situation in Epping. So the step trajectory was introduced according to the January 2019 Housing Implementation Paper because the council had realised that the plan as submitted would not sustain a 5-year supply. That's paragraph 2.1. So the step trajectory has been added after the plan was submitted as a sound plan for examination. That's a distinct difference with the Guildford situation where they did actually submit their plan with a step trajectory. So we have a situation where we're trying to resolve a problem which the council had identified after they'd submitted that plan. That's their statement. And the step trajectory that's been introduced seeks to neutralise the shortfall. It actually goes beyond that, if my maths are correct, and I'm happy for Mr. Coleman to update me accordingly, but we'd agreed at the outset that we had a supply of 1,856 dwellings, and if the step trajectory is applied for the same period, the requirement is 1,512, which by my mathematics gives you a surplus of 344. So why is the step lower if it's intended simply to deal with the with the backlog over that period and to match exactly what has been supplied? Why in fact actually does it go the other way and create a surplus? And that goes to the points that were made to my left in terms of the counterproductive nature of a step. It essentially neutralises the requirement for the 20% buffer. I know we haven't discussed that yet, but it also negates, arguably, if the Sedgefield methodology was applied, and is counter to the government policy in terms of significantly boosting the supply.
Just on the point of the buffer, I think we'll probably, I was going to try to deal with the buffer before lunch, but I think we'll do that. We'll do that afterwards. But one question I will have for the council is really with the step trajectory, what's the purpose of the buffer, other than as a sort of technical calculation? So that will be a question I want to ask. So don't do too much.
No, I'm not going to go there.
Thank you.
No, I will go there when we get to that point, if that's okay. So we've been told that I think impossible was the terminology in terms of the answer to your question for why it's not possible to allocate further sites. And if I understood the debate yesterday when we were having an extensive discussion in the morning and the afternoon about the site selection report, that the position that the council had actually reached with that site selection report was that it had more sites than it actually needed. So as in the sites had passed that site selection methodology to a point where they were acceptable for allocation, but they didn't need all of them. And just to quantify that, because this is a numbers session, if we were to take the approach that Mr. Bohr set out in the Guildford case, so that is a Liverpool 20% and the flat trajectory, and we take the council's preferred 5-year period, so starting 2018, to get back to a bang-on 5-year supply, the council would need roughly 1,100 dwellings additional in that 5-year period. By my mathematics, the difference between the two versions of the site selection report, between the regulation 18 and 19, where there were sites that were taken out because they were not needed, not because of any other reason, if I understood that position, the difference is roughly 1,088 dwellings. So that's an illustration. It's not my suggestion. I'm not putting that forward as a solution. It's an illustration of, if you like, the scale of the problem is not as great to get back to a break-even point. A break-even point is clearly insufficient. You would need to go beyond that, but it's far from impossible. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam. Coming back to the point that's been made by others, I struggle to understand why there's any relevance attached to the historic housing requirement. That dates back to a very old structure plan, and there's no relationship to what is now required in the District Council moving forward with their own objectively assessed need. That's my first point, which is picking up on others. And I think it is also clear that the local authority have provided you with a very sweeping generalisation that there are insurmountable highway issues that affect development growth in Epping over and above what they're proposed. For example, our site in Jigwell had no such objections raised to it in terms of the site selection process. It had other issues, but they, again, were not insurmountable. And it seems to me, as Mr. Neame has alluded to there, it is quite an easy process for the local authority to pick up other sites to make up the shortfall in housing allocations, focusing on settlements, particularly that have very good public transport facilities, for example. And it strikes me that that could be the starting point, identifying the larger settlements, identifying those with the preferred public transport options, and then seek further small site allocations on that basis. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Madam. And endorsing all the points that have gone around the table, and the long and short of which is that you have the technical evidence there from the council that there are deliverable sites that will not have an impact on the Epping Forest SAC or on local road infrastructure. And this goes to the council's claim that a significant amount more technical work will be needed should they be required to find further sites, and it's simply not the case. You have that evidence there. It wasn't the case at Guildford where they turned around additional sites fairly quickly. In terms of its sustainability appraisal issue, then we all know that that's an iterative process up until the point of adoption. The council are producing main modifications at the moment, and so that there's nothing to stop them going through this process and updating the SA alongside the main modifications process and having that up to date before adoption. Just touching again on Guildford, and I think one point that hasn't been raised in terms of some of the justification for a stepped trajectory was around a significant number of the strategic sites in Guildford were reliant on a road investment strategy scheme for improvements to the A3 to come forward. Clearly, in Epping Forest and with a number of sites around the table, that isn't the case, and you do have sites that can come forward in the first 5 years.
Thank you. Mr. Stebbing.
Thank you, Madam. I'm also, I think as virtually everybody is, addressing the second of your square bullet points. I don't think Mr. Coleman gave you a credible response to that question that you've posed, and he has not demonstrated sufficient justification as to why, through yourself in a series of main modifications, additional sites cannot be allocated in this plan to boost housing supply, and that's the key word here. And I think you will conclude, looking at everything in the round, that housing delivery will be under pressure, certainly in years 1 to 5 of this plan period, and probably in the first few years of step 3 under the council's step trajectory. So say years 6, 7, 8. And just bear in mind that the year 6 is actually only 4 years away from now. So the strategic sites are expected to start delivering at a rate of 742 per annum in just over 4 years' time. I don't think that is necessarily achievable. I believe you will conclude, again, looking at everything in the round, this plan needs added flexibility. So I would put to you that the plan does need some additional housing allocations in years 1 to 5. I put 2 sites to you yesterday where the site assessments have been flawed. Not just flawed, fundamentally flawed. SR 0890, you have the references. If you unpick those flaws, Madam, you will see that both sites, Roydon, Lower Shearing, deliverable, highly sustainable, proximate to local facilities, etc. I won't go through what I said yesterday. That there is a pool of sites sitting there where site assessment work has been flawed, should be revisited, and provides an opportunity for you through the modifications process to ask the council to make the necessary allocations to boost supply. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Clues. Again, I know it's unfair on the people around the table, but there's a clear sort of point emerging. I don't need to hear it again in relation to the other three boards around the table. I'll ask the council to come back on that. So you don't need to make that point again.
In that case, I won't make that point again.
Thank you.
What I would come back to then is actually this point that was raised by Mr. Ricks as well about transport constraints, and it comes also onto Mr. Mr. Taylor's point about the way the plan was actually prepared. Back in our Reg 19 representations, Reg 20 representation, we were pointing out that the sort of level of highway information that was available at that time, at least publicly. And at that time, it was the HAR, it was the Highway Assessment Report. I know that there's now a January Transport Assessment Report. But at that time, that report was actually saying that, that the higher growth scenarios generally improve the forecast traffic situation as opposed to those previously tested with only marginalised local increases. Now, this does come back to the point about the mindset when this plan was prepared. The council seemed to have taken a view that all of these constraints exist when actually the evidence at that time that it was prepared didn't really reflect that at all. And we're aware that, of course, the I think it was called the Strategic Highway Modelling and Mitigation Strategy was actually not available at that time. We only had the Highway Assessment Report. Now, that report didn't even go into stages of traffic impact. It was an end model proposal. But even in that that report, it was clear that that the evidence wasn't really backing up the council's view that OAN, as it was at that point in terms of the way the plan reported on this issue, but OAN, but also 5-year supply, was actually constrained by the transport impacts. And that may be updated by the 2019 January Transport Assessment Report, but certainly when it was prepared, that clearly the evidence did not exist to suggest that OAN should be constrained by highways.
Thank you. Ms. Bryan.
I am going to make a different point from everybody else. Firstly, back to what Mr. Newton said about reliance on the strategic master plan areas. I just want to confirm that the Northwood Bassett master plan is at a similarly advanced stage to Latin Priory, and we will be well placed to bring deliveries forward as soon as the plan's adopted. A comment was made about why speculative applications haven't been made, and that's simply because in the case of our site, we're complying with the emerging policy position of preparing the strategic master plan first. My second point, I think Mr. Coleman has provided sufficient justification for no need to reconsider the entire site selection process and go back to points that I've made earlier about in a Greenbelt authority. This would mean no deliveries, which would, that we've talked about denying people the right to housing and not boosting housing significantly. And yes, it would prevent housing coming forward. If you are persuaded that more needs to be done, the answer could be in the existing proposed allocations. We've heard arguments from others about capacity of allocations possibly being increased, and certainly in the case of North Weald, but I'm aware of other allocations as well where these have been pared back, and a relook at the boundaries in detail could yield more capacity from the existing allocations. Thank you.
Mr. Ireland.
Thank you. I'll try and be as quick as I can. I think where I'd like to start is just what the planning practice guidance says about this, which is that a step trajectory should, and it's explicit in this point, a step trajectory should not be simply used to delay meeting identified housing needs. And so we do need to bear in mind that government's own view on this is that a step trajectory is essentially a solution of last resort. To look at other factors first before you get to a step trajectory being justified. There is then a question of how quickly the housing market can respond in this district, but you know, let's bear in mind this is an area with house prices of £490,000. And the market characteristics would suggest that it is an area that is capable of responding, the market is capable of responding strongly and rapidly if the land's available. And I think that market characteristics is a point that is different from some other areas where these issues have been considered. Obviously, Guildford is also strong. We then, I think, need to bear in mind that perhaps a unique factor of this plan is that no allocations are delivering over the next 3 years. And the trajectory the council has set out shows that. But what that means is that there is very limited impact of a longer examination. And if examination was lengthened by a matter of a few months, that is going to have a positive impact on housing delivery in this area, rather than one which is simply delaying sites moving and allocations coming forwards. So there's a positive impact that you could have in that respect. And I think just my final point is just looking at, I do think there's, and as you've picked up on, I do think there is a particular question about looking at the justification for the specific steps that are set out. If we look at the first of those steps, the 265 a year to 2018, now that has principally arisen because of the council's slow progress in plan making. So if I go back and look at the 2011-12 annual monitoring report, this plan was supposed to be at this stage at examination in 2013. Where we are now is 6 years on from that, and the slow progress in plan making is a reason why, and a key reason why that that low delivery has occurred. Now, I think when you then also look at the housing delivery test, which becomes important in decision making moving forwards, the housing delivery test results currently show 49% housing delivery, looking back over the last 3 years. That's what's been published by government in the last month or so. Now, the council's proposed approach of essentially setting the requirements for the first part of the plan period to 2018 would be that it magically has a much higher number. And so its housing delivery performance, not through actually delivering any more homes, but through a mathematical calculation, would suddenly become substantially better. Now, I don't think that's what government has intended in the approach that it's set out. It's trying to use planning tools to help to boost housing supply. We then, I think, come to the next stage where we have a housing requirement put forward by the council in the stepped approach at 425 a year, which falls below the district's identified housing need. And we've heard about the effect that will have on that can be expected to have on affordability and social problems. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the effect of that would mean that this is a plan which hasn't met housing need for 12 years, a full 12-year period from 2011 to 2013, more than a decade. And I don't think, from any of the examples from elsewhere, there's any precedent for that scale of a trajectory being set up where that is the effect.
Thank you. Just before we have a break for lunch, I mean, obviously there's an emerging theme around the table in relation to this pool of sites that is unconstrained in some way. Can I ask the council to address that point? I mean, are there some sites that don't have negative marks against them for the SAC reason or the infrastructure reason? It sounds like there are, and so just be very clear about why it would cause such delay, why there would be such a problem to add some of those in. Is there a sort of wider implication for the strategy as a whole? Particularly thinking about the SAC, are there sites in areas where it won't affect the SAC issue? And if it would, then why, when you add it, why would it be a problem when you add it in, when you look at the plan as a whole?
Thank you, Madam. I'll address that. If I could also come back on some of the other points, that would be really helpful. Thank you. In terms of your specific question, there is no evidence that the council has at the moment that further sites are deliverable if included within this plan. Now, there are a number of constraints which I've mentioned. Perhaps I didn't give enough emphasis to the key constraint that we are experiencing at the moment. There is an outstanding objection to this plan from Natural England. There have also been objections from Essex County Council, but the issues around Natural England relate to concern about impact on Epping Forest SAC. They're not only about recreational impact, they're also about air quality. And the air quality issue covers the entire district. Recreational pressure is obviously more isolated in terms of there is an identified zone of influence. However, that zone of influence may be subject to change as further work is being undertaken. The air quality issue is outstanding, and that's partly why you've kindly agreed to move back the hearing sessions to a later date to consider the habitats regulation assessment. So I just think it's really important to understand that you cannot look at an individual site being included in the plan as being deliverable at this stage, because you need to look at the plan and its cumulative impact. And the work that the council has undertaken, particularly in terms of air quality monitoring and modelling, is looking at the package of the plan. And we're still at this stage waiting for Natural England to confirm their acceptance to the approach that the council has taken. So we're very confident that they will be encouraging in their response, and that will come back at a later hearing session. But at this moment in time, it's not possible to just add in further sites. I'd also like to counter...
Sorry, on that point,
Sorry.
you mentioned earlier the moratorium on...
Yep.
Does that cover the whole district? You just explain that briefly, what that's about.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, okay.
So there is a moratorium, particularly in relation to both recreational pressures and air quality issues in the district. So until there is a mitigation strategy in place covering both air quality and recreational pressure, Natural England cannot, will potentially object to planning applications, and also the council needs to be satisfied under the habitat regulations that the impact will be mitigated. So in carrying out the council's responsibilities in determining applications, not so much under the Planning Act, but under habitat regulations, we need to make sure that we're comfortable that the cumulative impact has been considered appropriately, and that Natural England are content with that approach.
And does that exist as a document?
Well, certainly there's many
explanation
documents from Natural England outlining their position in terms of their approach, and there are documents available on the council's website in terms of the council's approach to this issue at the current time. So planning applications are being held essentially until this issue is resolved. There is an interim recreational strategy in place, which is allowing some applications now to move forward. But where there is any potential impact on air quality, those applications are being held. And that will continue to be the case until we have an agreed strategy and until this process moves forward.
Thank you.
So I think that's a really, really critical point in terms of constraints. Sorry, my colleague.
Just to reassure you, work is ongoing on this. We have a report due to go to Cabinet on the 11th of April, outlining the way in which we're taking forward the air quality strategy. And that will give delegated authority, if it's approved, to the portfolio holder to agree the air quality strategy. Obviously, the council is very keen to move this forward as soon as it possibly can.
If I could also just carry on in terms of some of the other issues, I really counter the point that the council has not made every effort to boost short-term supply. I think we absolutely have, but for the reasons I've just given, it's very, very difficult to boost short-term supply further than we have. And I've told you previously about the work of the site selection process and how we've done that. I think it's also important to stress that we have followed the planning practice guidance in terms of how we've approached the stepped trajectory. There's evidence within the housing implementation strategies to show how the PPG requirements have been met. Importantly, we have consulted with our neighbouring authorities about the potential for them to take some of our unmet need, and that's documented throughout the update to the housing implementation strategy. Appendix 8 actually sets out the correspondence that we've had with those councils. Also, the original housing implementation strategy, which the update should be read in conjunction with, provides a lot more detail about how those PPG requirements have been considered on page 5. It also sets out a lot more about the work that the council is doing to front load development and bring forward development on allocated sites in order to boost the short-term supply and again to make every effort to boost that short-term supply. Just in terms of, this is probably more relevant for Northfield, Bassett and Epping, I did mention other constraints that exist, but we are continuing to work with Essex County Council over their concerns about the impacts of growth on the road network. We've recently submitted a position statement to you, a summary update to the Statement of Common Ground, which proposes some changes to the policies for Northfield, Bassett and Epping to try and counter those concerns. Mention was made to the Arran local plan examination, and just to give you comfort, I actually worked for Arran and I produced their step trajectory as well as this one here, so I have a good understanding of the context for producing a step trajectory, and that approach was, as you've heard, was endorsed by the inspector in that case, and whilst the circumstances are not identical, clearly some of the same principles do apply. I think lastly, just to confirm that the plan does significantly boost the housing supply for the district, and actually what will allow housing to come forward and be delivered is adopting the plan so we can get on and bring forward the allocations within it.
Thank you. We'll take a break there for lunch. When we come back, we need to discuss the buffer. As I said, I think my perhaps key question on the buffer, first of all, obviously the council's proposing a 5% buffer, and so there's a question about whether that's justified in relation to past delivery, but also I do have the question as to whether how much purpose the buffer has in any case in a step trajectory, particularly if the idea of it is to bring forward supply from later on. If you say you can't, then if you're not also going to increase supply, I'm not quite sure what the buffer is other than a technical exercise. So perhaps if you could address that. We'll then take the other points, we'll take those points together with the ones below so that we can move on hopefully quite rapidly to the 5-year land supply. Should we have a break until, if we just say 2:05? Thank you.